Hey everybody, this is Texas State Representative Trey Martinez Fischer. Welcome back to Politics, all things Texas. We're going to have a great show today. We're going to talk about redistricting. We have some powerhouses. We have my good friend, your good friend, and our Congressman Joaquin Castro. And we have Michael Lee from the Brennan Center, which is a voting rights think tank, nationally respected across the country. It's going to be a great show. Thank you for watching. If you like my hat and you're watching the video portion of this, this is my very good friend, Martinez, has a company called Creative. You've seen the Ese es Amor banner in downtown San Antonio, and this is her hat. And so if you like it, you can find it online. You can find it at Felice Modern there at the Pearl, and show some love for San Antonio. And remember, follow that hashtag Ese es Amor. Ese es Amor, Martinez. Thank you for this gift. Thank you for listening to Politex. We're going to have a great show. Thank you for listening. If you have a suggestion for the show or an idea for a potential episode, I value your feedback. Email your suggestions to contact@TreyMartinezFisher.com. As always, thank you for listening to Politics. Hey, everybody, welcome back. On today's pod, we have a wonderful show today. This is redistricting. This is the, full contact sport of politics. Those of you who followed this in the last decade, this was a fight that went pretty much the entire decade. And we just recently resolved these maps. And here we are again, looking at new census data to decide what is going to be the next round of redistricting for state representative seats, Texas Senate, and of course, congressional seats. And so I've got some great guests that are really going to provide some wonderful perspective. We have, somebody you already know, my very good friend, and actually my congressman, and that is Congressman Joaquin Castro from San Antonio, the Texas 20th. Man, it's good to see you, bud. And then we have another good friend of mine that I actually got to know about 10 years ago because there was this real famous blog in redistricting and this guy seemed to have all the information about 30 seconds faster than everybody else. And I ended up meeting him in the back of a federal courtroom. His name is Michael Lee. He was from Dallas. His heart will always be a Texan, but now I think he's officially claimed by the state of New York. And he's with the Brennan Center, which is really the leading advocacy think tank and work group that deals with all things on voting rights. So, Michael, thank you for joining the show. And so,
yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course, well, let's kick this off. I mean, very, very recently this week there was an announcement that there's going to be a projected 2 additional seats in Congress coming to the great state of Texas. What does that mean, Joaquin? I mean, you're up there every day fighting in the halls of Congress. What does this announcement mean to you?
Well, I mean, it's great for the state of Texas. We're the state that, again, for the second time in a row, picked up the most seats of any state in the nation. So it'll add to Texas's congressional power, congressional delegation, and so forth. But, when I read the news earlier this week, I really thought we were going to get 3. And I know there's this debate about whether Latinos have been undercounted. And in Texas, I think they were, because the state didn't lift a finger really to do anything on, getting people to fill out the census. And then you remember Donald Trump initially wanted to use a citizenship question in the census form. But look, just the fundamentals of it, obviously Texas gaining more seats than anybody else for the state. That's a good thing. But I think we missed out on one.
No, I agree. And, and Michael, just sort of filling in there. I mean, as you look across the Southwest, a lot of states that thought they were going to gain seats actually didn't, or I believe in the case of California, they may have lost a seat, which has never happened before. So, I mean, tell us, from your assessment, should Texas have received a 3rd seat in Congress?
Well, I think it's probably not hard to say that Texas should have received a 3rd seat. It lost the 3rd seat by about 191,000 people. Which is a lot of people, but in contrast to states like California and New York, which spent tens of millions of dollars on getting people to participate in the census and making sure they understood its importance, Texas allocated $0 in its 2019 legislative session towards census participation, which is really inexplicable, given that not only do congressional seats come to states because of the census, but so do federal dollars. $1.5 trillion of federal funds are allocated every year based on the census for everything from education to roads to, for that matter, vaccines. Part of the number of vaccines that states got was based on the 2010 census, right? And so, critical things flow to states based on the census, and the fact that Texas spent $0, I think, is like almost criminal. if it,
Yeah, it was bad. I mean, yeah, it was just, yeah, I think that's right. It's almost criminal that the state wouldn't lift a finger to try to get people to fill out that census form when, as Michael mentioned, so much federal money comes based on those census tracts and those census numbers.
And well, no, and it's, go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say, New York, by contrast, both New York State and New York City spent like tens of millions of dollars, and New York was widely expected to lose 2 congressional seats, and it came within 89 people of not losing any. It ended up losing 1, but it came within 89 people of not losing any, and that really is a testament to the money that was spent. Because if you think about when the census was occurring, it's like right in the middle of the pandemic. New York has lots of hard to count communities. People live in these high-rise apartments in places like the Bronx, and they're really hard to, lots of immigrants and everything like that. So New York should have had a really hard time, but the investment that New York put in, I think, really helped it mitigate, a lot of bad factors.
Well, and they were trying to do that when New York was trying to count when New York had gotten hit very hard very early in that pandemic as well.
Yeah. Well, no, let me throw like just a little perspective here. I mean, we have a newly appointed director of the census, a Latino from San Antonio, and being involved in the redistricting litigation 10 years ago, I know that there was oftentimes lawyers would talk about challenging this undercount and making it a fact issue in the case and looking for adjustments to the census. I mean, is that, something that's possible, given everything we know that the Trump administration did to make it hard for the census to actually work?
Well, there oftentimes are suits that challenge the census, but they more often than not fail for a host of like legal and sort of remedial issues, right? I mean, because in part, the remedy is to like redo the census, right? And that, that is not going to happen for many reasons. So it can be hard to remedy, which doesn't mean that, there can't be things that can be done, when you're talking about, litigation or how states, what data states use, right? States may be able to sort of supplement some of the data based on other evidence or something like that, because there's no requirement that the states use the census. They have to use the best available information, and some of that information might be supplemented by experts and others, and that's something that might happen.
Well, let's get to another question that's really kind of the meat of the matter. I mean, I still have these redistricting nightmares every so often. And if you recall, 10 years ago in the last census, the state grew by 4 million people. And because of that growth, we received 4 new seats in Congress, the largest growth Texas ever received in the history of the state. The last time Texas received that kind of power was during the years of Reconstruction after the Civil War. And 90% of that growth was minority. And as a result of that growth and all of that minority population, Texas received 0 minority opportunity seats in Congress and had to fight to get the seats that we have today. So now that we have 2 seats, the elbows are going to come up, the political elbows are going to come up. And Joaquin, what do you think, based on the census and the growth, where do you think these seats, where should they be drawn?
Well, that's a great question. And I haven't seen, exactly within the state which regions grew more than others. I mean, obviously the big metro areas all grew: San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Houston, et cetera, probably the Rio Grande Valley. And so I think there's probably going to be opportunities to draw those 2 new districts in a few, justified drawing them in a few different places if you were trying to be fair. The thing is, as you just mentioned, there's no indication that the Republicans in 2010 were trying to be fair at all, right? And so I expect that they're going to try to do the same thing this time. Now, there's some fundamental political differences this time, though, than 2010. In 2010, you didn't have that many Republican members of Congress, at least, who were in competitive districts or competitive races. That's not the case now, where you've got folks like Mike McCall, Chip Roy, even Van Taylor, who won by about 10 points, but other districts that are getting fairly close. And so what I suspect will happen is that they'll try to plus up plus up their incumbents in those districts, and then see where else they may be able to get away with taking those 2 seats as well. But it's going to be really interesting to see how it unfolds over the next several months.
Michael, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think a critical question for Republicans going into this cycle of redistricting is whether they want to be greedy or be a little bit more prudent. And in the past they've opted for greedy, but the problem with being greedy is that you have to spread your voters out really thin, because the way that you gerrymander, you don't draw districts that Republicans win by 80%, because then you're concentrating your voters. What you want to do is spread your voters out among many, many districts and try to win a bunch by 52%, 53%. But in a state like Texas that's growing so fast and that's changing demographically so fast, that can end up biting you by the end of the decade. And you saw that in Dallas County, where Republicans lost all but 2 of the state House seats because they were a little bit too greedy, and they didn't create some minority opportunity districts that they could have, which would have shored up a bunch of districts for them. Whether they want to do that kind of dummy mander maneuver, as they call it, a redistricting, or whether they want to be a little bit more prudent, is something that I think remains to be seen. That said, there are going to be a lot of people, particularly on the congressional map, that will say, like, be greedy and let us get as many seats as we can, because that will give us control of Congress for the next 2 or 4 years, and we'll worry about the rest when it comes. And go for the gusto. Dare a court to strike it down. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? And that has been their approach in the past, and it may be in the future. But there are many places where they certainly could be shore up things, like Austin's a prime example, right? That almost ended up biting them seriously, and creating an Austin-based district would solve a lot of problems for Republicans, but they may not be that smart.
Well, now I'm thinking, like, using the state house as a comparison. I mean, there are several Republicans in Dallas County and several Republicans in Tarrant County in the Fort Worth area that are really, really rethinking how they drew those maps. And they went for the gusto 10 years ago, and now they find all of them, within single digits of maintaining, their incumbency. And so, I think for these members of Congress, they're going to be thinking the same thing. Now, while that's taking place on the Republican side, we can't, allow what's been happening, allowing Republicans to sort of define what are new seats for Democrats. And by that, I mean, as they picked on Congressman Doggett and gave him the Fajita district from Austin all the way down to downtown San Antonio, and really, across the street from my neighborhood where Joaquin Castro went to high school, and say, okay, well, that's a brand new seat for minorities. Well, really, it's not. It's the congressional seat that was in Austin that belonged to Congressman Doggett. And in an attempt to just mess with him and to stretch him out several miles, that's what you did. So we can't say, okay, that is the new minority seat that was created with 4.4 million minorities in the last census. And so,
they'll do that again. I would expect that that's exactly what they're going to try to do again in some other version, right? Yeah. And really, I mean, I think, Trey, that it speaks to the need to. I think the ultimate solution is that we move to a place where we politicians are not drawing our maps anymore, that you have an independent redistricting commission, as you do in other states, that's trying to draw it more fairly.
Well, I'm gonna give Michael's opinion on that, but let me say, in response to that, is when we were in this federal courtroom for the last 10 years, and we were literally just spanking the attorney general, hearing after hearing, fact after fact, when someone said, well, we just need these redistricting commissions, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, you all have been dividing this state for decades, and now we're finally getting the keys because the census growth is turning in our direction, and all of a sudden you want to get righteous? I mean, like, oh, wait a minute, let's go to an independent commission. Well, no. Let me hold on to the keys for a couple of decades. Let me draw some maps, and then we can talk commission. But Michael, how do we do a redistricting commission? Because at some level, there's going to be some politics. I mean, you can't create a commission out of osmosis. I mean, someone's going to appoint these members, and how can it be done in a fair way?
Well, I think I'll start by just saying, like, there are lots of different paths to redistricting reform. One size doesn't fit all, and states are different. But the key to a good redistricting reform is simply breaking up the one-party monopoly, right, where one party gets to make all of the decisions, which is right now what happened in Texas, because Republicans control both houses of the legislature, they control the governor's mansion, and so they really are in the driver's seat. And breaking that up, and so, for example, a commission can require support from both sides, right? Or if you include independents, all three sides, right? In the process, and that just creates checks and balances in the process, and that itself means either people will compromise or it will deadlock and will go to a court, right? But one party doesn't get to make all the decisions, and then you have to fight about it in court. It will be a little bit more balanced of a process. And we know from states like California that the independent commission there created very responsive maps and increased minority representation. But as Democrats win more votes, they win more seats. As Republicans win more votes, they win more seats. And you saw that play out in the last two elections. So there's a lot to be said for independent commissions, but it's certainly not the only way you could go. You could just Ohio has created a process where you have to have a majority, including certain level of support from the minority party. Connecticut requires a 2/3 majority. So there are lots of ways that you could sort of break up the one party monopoly. But you could also, another key really would be just strengthening the rules around redistricting. Because Texas, especially with congressional redistricting, it doesn't have a lot of rules, right? So you could basically do whatever you want and make up rules. Creating some more rules around redistricting. And there's a bill, as the Congressman well knows, HR 1 in the House, S1 in the Senate, the For the People Act, that would create uniform national rules around congressional redistricting, including banning partisan gerrymandering by statute, and that would go, I think, a long way.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, I'm not agnostic on this idea of commissions, but it only seems to come up, as the demographics have changed in Texas, differently. And one thing that's always really struck me is, I'm sitting in this federal courtroom and probably, one of the youngest lawyers in the room, and I'm not there to argue the case. I'm actually represented by lawyers as the chairman of MALC, the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. And one older voting rights lawyer, gets his turn at the podium and pretty much says, Your Honors, the only thing that's changed in voting rights in the state of Texas is really the color of the jerseys. Because when the Democrats were in charge of the legislature, minorities like us, we pretty much got screwed when it came to, representative districts. And now the Republicans, are in charge. Well, they're still screwing us in voting rights, and here we are, we continue to fight. And it never really struck me, but to this day, I still remember that about, there's a reason why Texas is a covered jurisdiction and why we needed the protection of the Justice Department, which brings us to, back to my congressman here is, you all have worked really hard to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act out of the House. It's now in the Senate. Give us some behind the scenes, man. Give us stuff that we're not going to see in the Express News. I mean, what's really going on with this debate as it now, I guess is in the U.S. Senate?
Well, as Michael mentioned, the House has passed both HR 1 and which is For the People Act, which is the major bill on dark money, on congressional redistricting, and then the John Lewis Voting Rights Act we've also passed. So I feel like the House at least has kind of done its part. These bills are now in the Senate. And it's hard to imagine that there are going to be 10 Republicans who decide that they want to support these pieces of legislation. So at that point, there are only a few avenues left. There's a question about whether the senators will agree to change the filibuster rule, whether you reform it so that it's only a majoritarian rule, or you drop it down to 55 or 53 or something, or whether you can get any part of this done through reconciliation. And that'll be tough. Otherwise, look, we could find ourselves getting through this entire term as Democrats with the presidency, the Senate, and the House, and we come out with no major voting rights legislation or reform. Not to mention all the other things like immigration and wages and so forth, but we come out of here with no real reform.
But what's sort of the talk though, among the members? I mean, I'm sure everybody's sort of thinking about the 2010 midterm elections, or President Obama had all this momentum, went into the midterms, completely decimated majorities, things changed, and then of course as a control of a party changes or control of a chamber changes, then everything changes, comes to a stop. I mean, are you think the U.S. Senate, are they mindful of hey, let's this is our shot, we better take it, or are they more just sort of stoic about it? I mean, what's the sentiment?
I mean, I think the overwhelming majority of the Democratic senators are open to reforming the filibuster. But you do have a few folks who, right now at least, looks like they're not. And, if there's no opening, if there's no reform, I just think it's going to be very tough to get to that 60 number. And also, I think if there's the other thing is that I think some people are trying to make the case, even if you just made an exception for one category of legislation, which is voting rights legislation, because what we've seen is consistent attacks by Republicans in different states, including Georgia, Texas. You see what's going on in Florida. They've been attacking voting rights for a long time. So I guess the pressure on the senators is, hey, why don't you make an exception on the filibuster rule to do something about voting rights, to make sure voting rights are protected. Even if you don't want to even if you don't want to reform the filibuster for, increasing the minimum wage or for immigration, for healthcare, whatever it is, you've got to make sure that our democracy is protected.
Michael, is the Brennan Center, following or tracking, or, you have any ideas and thoughts of what could happen in the U.S. Senate with all these voting rights reforms?
Well, I haven't talked to Joe Manchin recently, but I think there is an increasing sense on the Hill that like something needs to give, and it's really driven in large part because of these attacks on voting. In 2020 we had a record turnout, and the response to that was not to sort of celebrate the fact that we had record turnout. It's to figure out ways to suppress the vote, and you see this all around the country. A record 361 bills, and it's actually more. We track it, but I haven't got the most recent update. But a record number of bills, including in Texas, that would do things like ban giving people water when they're waiting in line to vote, and and much worse things as well. And I think that is driving a conversation that like somebody has to step in and help right the ship, and that the only body that can do that really is Congress, but doing that will require some reform to the filibuster. It may not require getting rid of the filibuster completely, but it will require a willingness to recognize that, at least for the rules of the road, a majority should be sufficient.
And even if you had a talking filibuster, like in the Texas Senate, we all remember in 2013 when Wendy Davis spoke for hours and hours, but at the end of her speech, right, like at the end of your ability to stand up there and continue delivering a speech, the filibuster is over and they can proceed with the business of the Senate. Well, if you did the same thing in the United States Senate, you would see the same results. Somebody would give a speech for 13 hours or 20 hours or whatever it is, and then they would move on with the business of the Senate. So there's been some discussion about that. But right now, in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, you don't even have to actually go talk about anything. All you have to do is basically register your disagreement, and that's your filibuster maneuver, right? So people don't necessarily have any skin in the game on this thing.
Right. And so it's kind of hollow, right? I mean, it's like when you and I were in the state house, you say, hey, I have a point of order, right? I mean, it doesn't take a lot of dynamic just to utter that, And so the notion of just making the threat that you're going to filibuster brings everything to a halt unless you can get the 60 votes on cloture. Is that how it works today?
Yeah, yeah, basically so.
And so what I've seen, even Senator Manchin say is, hey, listen, I'm for a talking filibuster. I guess there's only so many times that Senator Cruz can read green eggs and ham. I mean, he's going to get tired. You look at, some of these senators, they're these folks are the notion of being on your feet for 13, 15, 20 hours, they might be able to do it. But as you said, it comes to an end at some point. And when it ends, you proceed with the vote. That's how it should work.
Right. Unless they persuade you, right? I mean, that's what they should use the filibuster for, is an attempt to persuade people like, hey, this provision in this bill is really bad for Montana or whatever, right? And that's perfectly, that's what it's meant for. Watch, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or something like that. That's what it's meant for. It's not meant to like permanently stall legislation, which is what happens now on bill after bill after bill after bill. So.
Well, we'll have to see more on that, but I think again, it's an interesting juncture in our national history with where we are at this moment with everything happening in the Biden administration and sort of as we head into to 2022 and what kind of election environment is going to be. And even in Texas, as Michael and and Congressman, you mentioned a lot of attacks on people's rights to vote. I mean, making it illegal to ask somebody if they want to vote by mail application. I mean, if you can believe that, that will now be a crime.
Yeah.
To vote late at night will be a crime. To have drive-through voting would be a crime. We're not talking about expanding the franchise anymore. We're talking about, this name of the game has become, let me maximize my base turnout and let me figure out a way to suppress my opponent's turnout. It's no longer who has the best ideas.
And also they've used this, I mean, Trey, they've used voter suppression as a crutch so that they don't have to come up with new ideas and win people over with their great ideas or their plans for governing or whatever it is. Rather than do that, rather than actually compete that way, instead, they're trying to limit who can vote, right? They're trying to make it harder for people that disagree with them to actually go out and vote against them. And so it's a very specious way to operate. And, I think it was Stacey Abrams or somebody said that it was basically another Jim Crow. And I think that's right, because you're essentially, your whole focus of winning an election becomes, how can I keep the people who disagree with me from going to the polls to vote?
Yeah, and some of it's a little ironic because, we had record turnout, including in Texas, and, Republicans did well in some parts of the state, right? I mean, unexpectedly, including in, parts of the Latino community, that seems to be like unusual Republican voters who don't usually vote coming out to vote. And so, it does show you that at least, those aren't my politics, but, at least, they have things that resonate with people, but rather than sort of like try to build on that and try to figure out what to engage with, communities, as the congressman said, they decided, let's ignore that opening that we potentially have and let's just go to vote suppression.
Right. No, I mean, obviously, all interesting stuff, and I guess we'll see the developments, and and hopefully, we'll see some big changes in Washington out of the United States Senate. So look, we have like a couple minutes left, and let's see if we can just wrap up on Michael, or any thoughts. I mean, as you sort of are tracking this redistricting across the country with respect to Texas, do you see a timeline of when you think map drawing begins, or when challenges in court are set to happen? Any ideas?
So Texas will get the data it needs to draw maps, which is to say the data about the block level data with people's race and ethnicity and age in mid-August, and it'll take a couple of weeks to process the data. But then after that, Texas could begin drawing maps. It could begin holding hearings, and it's doing that right now. But it won't have the data it needs to draw maps until about September or a little later, and we'll have to do that in a special session. As far as litigation, I would expect a suit potentially to be filed sooner than that. Someplace, just because people, that's now that we have the apportionment, we know that the districts are malapportioned, and so somebody will file a suit someplace, and that will sort of start the process. But the key thing I think to remember here is last time Texas finished its maps in June, and there was a full 6 months or so to sort of litigate over the maps. Now Texas will finish its maps potentially in October or November, and there will be less time to litigate over the maps, and that is something that I think you have to bear in mind, because 6 months wasn't enough time, last time, but it's potentially going to be even less this time, and there could be efforts to game the process, and I think that's something that not only in Texas but other states we're watching, just because people will use the delay as an excuse for taking shortcuts or cutting out the public or leaving less room for people to participate in the process, including the lawmakers on the other side.
So Joaquin, if Michael's right on that timeline, that means, we have maps, late October, as filing for office begins in November, lawsuits will be coming, potentially, moving the March primary. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that sounds about right. I mean, you remember 10 years ago, the primaries ended up happening, I think, in May. They got bumped from March to May. And I don't see, if everything happens that late before, I don't see how that's a quick turnaround to do the filing period, and then to do the primary and to resolve the lawsuits, at least, for an operating map, right?
because these lawsuits may continue on just like the other one did for almost a decade or whatever. Yeah.
Well, do us a favor. When you're back in DC, tell all your congressional friends, those Republicans, that if they want to know what it means to have a primary moved, just tell them Ted Cruz. You tell them that that's how we got Ted Cruz. He was elected in July. He was elected in July in a runoff. And look, I'm as political as they come. You were a political animal. Dude, I'm not thinking about voting in July. I don't know if you are, and that's exactly what's going to happen. So you want more Ted Cruz's in the congressional delegation? You give us some crappy maps and let's find ourselves fighting in federal court, moving that primary. So, look, we'll leave it at that. I mean, we're obviously no filter show, but we'll keep it PG-13. We had a great one. We had a great conversation. I mean, I really appreciate it. I mean, Congressman, I know you just got back in town, and you got things to do. Appreciate you making time. And Michael, our fellow Texan, always a Texan in the Big Apple now. Please give our regards to all the men and women at the Brennan Center working hard. And thank you for the work that you do to just put the data out, put the facts out, and let people consume it. And so, thank you for joining us on this show, and appreciate everything both of you do. Hey, everybody, thank you for listening. I want to thank my special guests, Congressman Joaquin Castro and Michael Lee from the Brennan Center. Thank you for supporting politics. We'll be back next week with another show. Until then, have a wonderful week.